The morning was overcast, as if nature itself had decided to match my mood. I stood at the window, mindlessly watching the sparse raindrops dripping down the glass. Today was the day of the reading of Howard's will, my husband's will. The thought still seemed unreal, like a bad dream from which it was impossible to wake up. The clock on the bedside table read 9 in the morning. It was 3 hours before the notary's appointment, but I was ready to go, a simple black dress, minimal jewelry, and discreet makeup to hide the traces of sleepless nights. Howard had always appreciated naturalness. "You're beautiful just the way you are, Ellie," he said, and it made me feel warm even in the coldest Vermont winters. I touched my wedding ring. 25 years, a quarter century together, and now I was alone in this big house filled with memories. Our first meeting was at Everglade High School, where I worked as a counselor. Howard had come in for counseling about his son, Noel. The 13-year-old had been going through the death of his mother 2 years earlier. He refused to study, was rude to teachers, withdrew into himself. His homeroom teacher referred him to me. "Minus Ms. Beckett," I introduced myself, extending my hand to a tall man with tired eyes and early gray on his temples. "Howard Hollister," he replied, and his handshake was firm and confident. "Thank you for agreeing to help. I don't know what to do about Noel anymore." His voice was filled with both despair and love for his son. I immediately felt that this man was carrying too heavy a load on his shoulders, running a family pharmacy, raising a troubled teenager, overcoming his own grief. I could not have imagined that this exhausted widower would become my husband, that I will love him for his kindness, for his integrity, for the ability to listen and hear other people, that his little drugstore on the main street of Everglade would become a thriving pharmaceutical company, and that our marriage would be the happiest time of my life. I sighed and stepped away from the window. There were framed photos on the mantelpiece: our wedding, our vacation at Lake Champlain, the opening of the new pharmacy in the next town over. Most of the pictures were of Howard and me alone, Noel almost always absent or standing off to the side with a strained smile. The relationship with my stepson hadn't worked out from the beginning. I remember the look in his eyes at our first official meeting, when Howard introduced me as his bride. The cold, appraising gaze of a teenager with the silent question, "What do you want with my father?" I understood him. As a psychologist, I saw him not just as a troubled child, but as a man going through the trauma of loss. His mother had died of cancer, and Noel may have felt betrayed by seeing his father with another woman. I didn't try to replace his mother. That would have been disrespectful to his feelings and Caroline's memory. Instead, I tried to be a friend, a support, someone he could trust. I tried different approaches. I took an interest in his hobbies, computer games and skateboarding at the time. I helped him with his homework, especially with literature, which he hated. Cooked his favorite meals. Didn't impose, but was always there for him when he might need me. Sometimes it felt like the ice was melting. There were moments when Noel forgot his hostility, laughing at my jokes, sharing school stories, accepting help. But then the wall would grow back, higher and stronger than before. Howard tossed himself between us, trying to keep the peace in the family. I could see how hurt he was that the two people closest to him couldn't find common ground. He never blamed Noel or demanded that he love me, but I knew he was secretly hoping for a reconciliation. "Give him time, Ellie," he said, hugging me in the evenings. "He's a good boy, he just needs time." I gave time, years. But even as Noel grew up, graduated from law school, married Camille, and had children of his own, his attitude toward me didn't change. He just learned to hide his dislike better, masking it with formal politeness in front of his father. It always amazed me that Howard, so perceptive in other matters, seemed not to notice his son's true attitude, or pretended not to. But something had changed in recent years. I'd catch his pensive glances when Noel once again found an excuse not to come to a family dinner, or when he refused to introduce me to his business associates. "You know, Ellie," Howard said to me shortly before he got sick, "sometimes I think I spoiled Noel too much. Maybe it's my fault that he's grown up so demanding." I shook my head, going over the memories, and walked over to the closet. I needed to find the file folder that Howard had asked me to keep separate from the business papers. "Just in case," he said then, and there was a strange determination in his eyes. The folder was where I'd left it, in a box of old photo albums. I pulled it out and sat on the edge of the bed. Inside were copies of some deeds to the house, bank account information, and an envelope with my name written in familiar, angular handwriting. I'd never opened that envelope. Howard said it was in case something happened to him. Not the most fun reading, dear, but you might need it someday, he joked then, and we both laughed at the dark humor. Who could have known that moment would come so soon? Howard passed away 3 weeks ago. A heart attack. Sudden and unrelenting. I was there holding his hand when the ambulance arrived. All he could say was, "I love you, Ellie," and squeeze my fingers. And then he was gone. The days that followed were a blur of funerals, condolences, endless phone calls and visits. Noel took over the organizing, for which I was grateful. I just couldn't function normally. It was like a part of me had died with Howard. It wasn't until yesterday that I was finally able to bring myself to sort through my husband's things. His clothes still held his scent, a mixture of aftershave and the mints he always carried in his pocket. I sat on the floor of the dressing room, clutching his sweater to my face, and cried like I hadn't cried even at a funeral. Our marriage wasn't perfect, there's just no such thing. There were arguments, misunderstandings, resentments, but there was also a deep respect for each other, trust, and shared values. Howard valued my professional experience and often consulted with me about managing pharmacy staff. I learned to understand his business and offered ideas that he implemented, such as a counseling program for elderly clients or courses for pharmacists on the psychology of communication. "You've made my pharmacy special, Ellie," he said. "People don't just come to us for medicine, they come to us for care. You're the reason for that." A phone call snapped me out of my reverie. It was Martha, my closest friend and school colleague. "How are you, dear?" she asked. Her voice sounded worried. "I'm hanging in there," I replied, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Today is the reading of the will. Do you want me to go with you? I could use the moral support." I appreciated her offer but shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you, Martha, but I'll be fine. Only family and the notary will be there." "Will Noel be there too?" I could clearly hear the disapproval in her voice. Martha knew about my complicated relationship with my stepson. "Yes, of course, and Camilla and the children." "Well, keep me informed, and remember you can always count on me." After talking to Martha, I felt grateful to have people like that in my life. Friends who support me in times of need, colleagues who send condolence cards, former students who had grown up and started their own families, who came to the funeral to pay their respects to the man whose wife had once helped them through their teenage problems. I went back to the window. The rain had intensified, drumming on the garage roof. My gaze fell on the black SUV parked across the street. Noel's car. I didn't remember hearing him pull up. It was odd that he'd arrived so early. It was still 2 hours before my appointment with the notary. I saw the passenger side door open and Camille, his wife, stepped out of the car. She wore an elegant dark blue dress and held an umbrella to protect herself from the rain. Behind her, the children, 15-year-old Quentin and 13-year-old Laurel, showed up. Quentin was a carbon copy of his father at the same age, the same sharp facial features, the same tense shoulder line. Laurel, unlike her brother, had inherited the softness of her mother's features. They didn't walk toward the house, instead moving down the sidewalk toward the center of town. Probably decided to have breakfast at a cafe before an important meeting. I wasn't invited. It was typical of Noel to come into town and not even call. Even now that I'd lost my husband and he'd lost his father, he couldn't get past that wall of alienation. I sighed and turned away from the window. I had a hard day ahead of me, and I needed to pull myself together. Howard would want me to hold on with dignity, no matter what happened. I went down to the kitchen and made tea. Plain black, strong tea, just the way Howard liked it. We often sat here in the mornings, discussing the day's plans, sharing news, just enjoying each other's company. Now, the kitchen seemed too big and empty. There was still a handwritten note on the refrigerator, a list of groceries he was going to buy the day of the attack. I couldn't bring myself to take it down. As long as that note was in place, a part of Howard was still here with me. In the corner of the desk were the company documents he'd gone through the night before he died. I didn't touch them, as if he could come back and continue his work. Someone else would have to do it all now. Probably Noel, if that was Howard's will. I never took any interest in the financial side of our lives. Not because I was indifferent to my husband's affairs, but because I trusted him completely. I knew that our financial situation was solid, that the business was thriving, that we could afford to live comfortably and help others. That was enough. Only recently, when Noel had mentioned the value of the company in passing $25 million, I'd realized the magnitude of what Howard had created from a small family pharmacy. But those numbers meant nothing to me. Money wouldn't bring my husband back to me, wouldn't fill the void in our home, wouldn't heal the pain of loss. I looked at my watch. It was time to go out if I wanted to stop by the cemetery before my meeting with the notary. I found an umbrella, threw on my raincoat, and walked out into the rain, which seemed to intensify by the minute, as if the sky was mourning my loss with me. I placed a bouquet of white lilies, his favorite flowers, on Howard's grave. The rain had almost stopped, leaving the air fresh and clear. The cemetery was quiet, with birds singing from somewhere in the distance. I stood silent, not knowing what to say. All words seemed empty, unable to express the depth of my loss. "I miss you," I whispered, touching the cold marble of the tombstone. Every minute, every second. I didn't notice the cemetery caretaker, an older man with kind eyes, approaching. "Mrs. Hollister." He bowed slightly. "He was a good man, your husband. Always saying hello, asking how he was doing. Not everyone treats people like me that way." "Yes," I nodded, barely holding back tears. He could see people, the real people behind their positions and statuses. "It's a rare gift," the caretaker agreed, "especially for such successful businessmen." He delicately stepped back, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the dates on the tombstone. Too short a span for such a colorful life. Howard hadn't even lived to 70, though he'd always been healthy, eating right, exercising. Fate can be unfair. My thoughts went back to the beginning of our relationship. After that first meeting at school, I worked with Noel for several months. Gradually, the boy began to open up, his grades improved, and conflicts with teachers became less frequent. Howard often came to see me after school to discuss his progress. Our professional conversations quietly grew into friendship and then into something more. I fell in love with his sincerity, his devotion to his son, and his touching concern for the elderly pharmacy customers to whom he sometimes loaned medications, knowing his pension was not always enough. He fell in love with my ability to listen, my patience, my love of poetry, which I often quoted during our conversations. Our romance developed slowly and carefully. We were both afraid to rush things, he because of the trauma of losing his wife, I for fear of violating professional ethics, for Noel was still my patient. But feelings were stronger, and a year later we decided to get married. It was a modest wedding, just close friends and family. Noel looked lost and tense in his new suit. He smiled mechanically at the guests, but his eyes remained cold when he looked at me. At the time, I was still hopeful that things would change with time. After the wedding, I moved into the Hollister house, a spacious Victorian mansion on a quiet Everglade street. I had to get used to my new role, not just as a wife, but as the owner of the house, where Caroline's belongings and photographs were still stored. I didn't insist on removing them, realizing that my mother's memory was important to Noel. Gradually, I began to make changes in our household, trying to do so gently. Howard was supportive, grateful that the house was comfortable and warm again. "It's a real home again, Ellie," he said one evening as we sat by the fireplace. "You've brought life back into it." At the same time, I started helping him with the pharmacy. Not in financial matters, I didn't know much about that, but in organizing the customers and the staff. My psychological education was unexpectedly useful in business. I noticed that many elderly customers came to the pharmacy not only for medicine, but also for socializing. They could talk for hours about their illnesses, their children and grandchildren, their neighbors. The pharmacists, busy with their work, didn't always have time to listen to them, which sometimes led to misunderstandings and resentment on both sides. "Howard," I suggested, "what if we set up a little seating area in the corner of the pharmacy? Put a couple of comfortable chairs, a table, offer tea or coffee. People can sit down, take a break, talk." He enthusiastically supported the idea, and soon the socializing corner, as we called it, became the most popular place in the pharmacy. Older customers came early to take seats, brought homemade baked goods, and shared news. They felt part of the community, not just customers. Then I suggested training for pharmacists in the basic psychology of communication. Howard was hesitant at first. His staff were professionals in their field and might take it as criticism. But I developed a program that didn't teach them to work better, but to help them understand the emotional needs of customers, especially the elderly and chronically ill. When a person comes in for pain medication, I explained in the first training, they need not only pain relief, but also reassurance that their suffering is noticed and acknowledged. A simple, "I understand how difficult this is for you," can mean more than the most detailed explanation of the drug's mechanism of action. The pharmacists quickly saw results. Customers became more open, followed recommendations more closely, and came back to our pharmacy more often, even if other pharmacies were open nearby. Howard joked that I had turned his business into a pharmacy with a human face. When things picked up, we decided to expand. We opened a second pharmacy in a neighboring town, then a third. I developed uniform standards of service, which included not only professional but also psychological aspects of working with customers. Howard often consulted me when hiring new employees, trusting my intuition and ability to see a person's character. "You're my secret superpower, Ellie," he said. "Without you, I would never have been this successful." I knew that was an exaggeration. Howard had been a talented businessman long before I met him, but it was nice to feel useful, to be a part of his business, to see our joint ideas come to fruition. Noel, meanwhile, was growing up. At 16, he became even more withdrawn, spending all his free time in his room or with friends. He didn't come home until dinner time, he talked sparingly, and his answers to my questions were one syllable. I stopped insisting on a close relationship, giving him the space he so clearly demanded. After high school, he enrolled in a prestigious college in another state, choosing law school. The first year went relatively smoothly. Noel came home for vacations, spoke politely to his father, ignored me but without outright hostility. That all changed when he turned 18. During spring break, Howard and I decided to visit him on campus, bringing home cooked food and warm clothes. Noel reluctantly agreed to meet us, setting up a time in the student cafeteria. When we arrived, he was sitting at a table with a group of fellow students. When he saw us, he was visibly tense, but he stood up and waved. "Hi, Dad," he said, hugging Howard. He didn't even greet me. "Are these your parents?" one of the girls at the table asked, looking at us with interest. Noel paused for a second, and then said a phrase that still hurts my heart. "That's my father," he said, pointing to Howard. "And that's not my mother, just the one my father's sleeping with." There was an awkward silence at the table. The girl who'd asked the question blushed and lowered her eyes. One of the boys giggled nervously. Howard turned pale with anger. "Noel," his voice trembled. "Apologize to Eleanor at once." But Noel only shrugged his shoulders with feigned indifference. "For what? I told the truth. She's not my mother." We left almost immediately. Howard was so angry he could hardly speak. In the car, he apologized over and over again for his son, and I sat there numb with shock and humiliation. 5 years of trying to be Noel, if not a mother, at least a friend, undone by one phrase thrown with such cold contempt. That night, Howard and I had our first serious fight. Not because of Noel I understood his pain and anger, but because Howard kept making excuses for his son, looking for explanations for his behavior. "He just didn't know what he was saying, Ellie. You know teenagers. It's important for them to seem cool in front of their friends." "He's 18, Howard," I countered. "He's not a teenager anymore, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to humiliate me, and he succeeded." In the end, Howard went to his son's house alone and had a serious talk with him. I don't know what exactly was said, but after that, Noel became more reserved in my presence. There was no more open hostility, but there was no more warmth either. We existed in a state of cold truce, maintaining the minimum level of politeness necessary for Howard's sake. After college, Noel took a job at a law firm in Boston, where he met Camille. She came from a wealthy family, was educated, and ambitious. I hoped that marriage and having children would soften Noel's character, make him more mature and understanding. In part, it did. He became an attentive father and seemed to genuinely love his wife. But his attitude toward me didn't change. He rarely brought the family to visit, preferring to meet my father in restaurants or invite him to his home in the Boston suburbs. I wasn't usually included in those invitations, or if I was clearly reluctant at Howard's insistence. Quentin and Laurel, his children, were wary of me, clearly copying their father's behavior. They never called me Grandma, only Mrs. Hollister, as if I were a stranger. Howard noticed this and tried to remedy the situation, but to no avail. "Why do you let them treat you like that, Ellie?" he'd ask sometimes. "You deserve more respect than that." I just smiled and shrugged my shoulders. What could I say? That I didn't want to cause him any more problems? That I had learned to accept the situation as it was? That respect can't be demanded, it's either there or it's not. Over the years, Howard's relationship with his son had begun to change too, but for a different reason. Noel increasingly turned to his father for financial help. At first, they were reasonable requests: money for a down payment on a house, investments in the development of his law practice. Howard had always helped, happy to be able to support his son. But then the requests began to grow. Noel got into real estate investing, then startups, then cryptocurrencies. Each time he presented his projects as win-win, promised high profits, talked about incredible opportunities. And each time Howard provided the money, though I noticed that he frowned more and more as he studied his son's business plans. "You don't have to fund every idea he comes up with," I said gently one day, when Noel asked for a particularly large sum for a technology project. "I know, Ellie," Howard sighed. "But he's my son. I want him to succeed." "Of course," I agreed. "But maybe sometimes the best help is to let him work it out on his own." Howard thought for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe you're right, but not this time. This project does look promising." The project failed, like most of the others. Noel always found explanations: unfavorable market conditions, unscrupulous partners, unforeseen circumstances. Never his own mistakes or lack of experience. In the last months of his life, Howard became more cautious in financial matters. He turned down several of Noel's offers, much to his son's displeasure. I could hear their tense conversation on the phone as Howard tried to explain why he couldn't spare the money for another project. "It's not just your money, Dad," Noel said with undisguised irritation. "It's a family business, an inheritance that should go to me. I have a right to be involved in the decisions." "The business is still mine, son," Howard replied calmly but firmly. "And I'm responsible for its future. Someday it will indeed pass to you, but until then, I make the decisions." After that conversation, Howard sat in his office for a long time, looking at the family photos. When I came in, he looked up at me with tired eyes. "You know, Ellie, sometimes I think I've spoiled Noel too much. Always trying to make up for not having a mother, giving him everything he wanted. Maybe that was a mistake." I sat down next to him, took his hand in mine. "You were a good father, Howard. You did the best you could. Noel chose what kind of man he wanted to be." He smiled weakly and kissed my fingers. "You always know what to say. I don't deserve such a wise wife." In those last weeks before the attack, Howard talked often about inheritance. Not specifically, more like thinking out loud about what would become of the company, the house, the savings. "I want you to be protected, Ellie," he said one evening, "no matter what happens." "Don't say that," I begged. "You're going to live a long, happy life." He shook his head with an enigmatic smile. "No one knows what will happen tomorrow, but I've made some arrangements. You will know about them when the time comes." I didn't pay much attention to those words at the time. Now, standing at his grave before the reading of his will, I remembered every detail of our last conversations, trying to guess exactly what he meant. "It's time, Howard," I whispered, touching the cool marble. "I hope you know what you're doing." I stood at the grave for a moment longer, then reluctantly turned to go. I had a meeting with the notary and Noel's family ahead of me. I didn't know what to expect, but I was prepared for anything. For Howard's sake, I would remain calm and dignified, no matter what happened. The office of Bramble and Associates was in an old brick building in the center of Everglade. I'd been here before. Howard and I had renewed wills several times, done real estate paperwork. Aldous Bramble usually came to our house, but today was a special occasion that required a formal setting. I arrived 15 minutes early. Bramble's secretary, Mrs. Pierce, greeted me with a sympathetic smile. Minus Mr. Bramble is expecting you, Mrs. Hollister, she said, ushering me into the study. May I offer you tea or coffee? Tea, please, I answered, taking off my cloak. The rain had completely drenched me. Aldous Bramble rose from his desk to greet me. He was in his 70s, but he kept his posture straight and his eyes clear. His gray hair and neat beard made him look like a patriarch from the Victorian era. Eleanor. He shook my hand warmly with both of his. It's good to see you, though the circumstances are sad, of course. Howard was not only my client, but also my friend. This informal address surprised me a little. Usually Bramble was the epitome of old-fashioned politeness. But today there was genuine sympathy in his gaze, as if we were old friends bound by a common loss. Thank you, Aldous, I said, dropping the formalism. This isn't an easy day for me either. He pointed to the comfortable leather chair by his desk, not the standard visitor's chair, but the chair where the man himself usually sat during informal conversations. Please have a seat. The others haven't arrived yet, so we have time to talk. I sank into the chair, feeling his silent support. Bramble didn't sit across from me at his massive desk, but took the chair next to it, removing even a symbolic barrier between us. How are you holding up? He asked softly. Day by day, I answered honestly. Sometimes it seems to get easier, and then something reminds me of him, and it starts all over again. Time doesn't heal, as they say, Bramble said thoughtfully. But it teaches us to live with loss. I lost my wife 15 years ago, and I still talk to her in the evenings. His words touched me. I too often found myself turning to Howard, telling him about my day, asking for advice. And sometimes, in the quiet of the house, I thought I could hear his voice, his distinctive laugh. Mrs. Pierce brought tea, fragrant with a slice of lemon, just the way I liked it. Howard must have mentioned it once. Howard's been very worried about you these past months, Bramble said suddenly, stirring his tea. Not about your health, but about your future. He wanted to make sure you were protected, in every way. I nodded, not quite sure what he meant, but sensing something important behind the words. Before I could ask, however, there was a delicate knock at the door. Your stepson's family has arrived, Mrs. Pierce announced. Shall I show them in? Bramble glanced at his watch 7 minutes before the appointed time, and then looked at me questioningly. I nodded, finishing my tea. It was time to start. Aldous rose, but he didn't return to his desk. He remained standing next to my chair as if to emphasize his position. The secretary opened the door, and Noel entered the office, tall, trim, in an expensive dark gray suit. He was followed by Camille in the elegant blue dress I'd noticed that morning, and the children, Quentin and Laurel, unusually quiet and serious. Noel froze for a second when he saw Bramble and I standing side by side, as if we were old friends or allies. His gaze slid to my comfortable chair, to the teacups, to Bramble's hand resting lightly on the back of my seat. Minus Mr. Bramble, he finally stepped forward, extending his hand to the notary, then nodded to me. Eleanor. No hug, no words of condolence. It was as if we were meeting for a business meeting, not a reading of his father's will. Noel? I tried to smile. Camille, the kids. It's good to see you. Camille mumbled something polite, and the kids shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. Noel looked around, as if assessing the situation and searching for his place. Please sit down. Bramble pointed to the chairs in front of his desk. I watched Noel hesitate for a moment, looking at my comfortable chair and the simple chairs meant for him and his family. Then, as if making a decision, he confidently chose the center chair, gesturing for Camille to sit to his right. The children sat on either side of their mother. I remained in my chair, slightly away from them, but in a higher position, both physically and symbolically. Bramble returned to his desk, but before he did, he squeezed my shoulder lightly for support, a gesture that didn't escape Noel's attention. So we're all here, he said impatiently. Can we get started? Bramble nodded and pulled a file folder from his desk drawer. We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of Howard James Hollister, he began in a formal tone. I will ask you to refrain from commenting until after the reading. If you have any questions, we'll discuss them afterward. He opened the folder and put on his thin gold-rimmed glasses. I, Howard James Hollister, being of sound mind and firm judgment, hereby make my last will and testament revoking all previous wills and testaments. I listened to the standard legal wording while looking at the portrait of the firm's founder on the wall behind Bramble's back. A stern Victorian gentleman with thick sideburns, he seemed to look disapprovingly at our little gathering. My thoughts wandered. I remembered Howard and me on our last wedding anniversary, the quiet dinner at the lakeside restaurant, the long walk in the moonlight, his words about how grateful he was for every day with me. Who could have known he'd be gone in a month? Bramble's voice brought me back to reality as he began to read out the main part of the will. All of my estate, including my home, personal effects, financial assets, and the stock I own in Hollister Pharmaceuticals, totaling approximately $25 million, I divide as follows. I noticed Noel pitch forward, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair tightly. Camille straightened her back, her eyes narrowed in anticipation. I bequeath 50% of all of the above estate to my beloved wife, Eleanor Margaret Hollister, as a token of my deep love and appreciation for her years of support, devotion, and wisdom. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Noel tense, his jaw clenched, but he remained silent as Bramble had requested. I bequeath the remaining 50% to my son, Noel Allen Hollister. I express the hope that these funds will be used wisely by him and will serve to ensure the well-being of his family. I felt the tension in the room ease a little. Noel leaned back in his chair, his shoulders visibly relaxed. Camille allowed herself a slight smile. The will was fair, even generous after all. I'd only been Howard's wife for 25 years, while Noel was his only child. Bramble continued reading, moving on to more specific items: the management of the company, the distribution of individual values, charitable contributions. Howard was always attentive to detail, and his will was no exception. The management of Hollister Pharmaceuticals, pending a final decision on its future, shall be taken over by a board of directors chaired by Richard Mackenzie. I noticed Noel frown at those words. Richard Mackenzie was Howard's longtime friend and business partner, but Noel had never hidden his disapproval of his conservative approach to business. I specifically stipulate that the family home in Everglade at 17 Maple Street, with all furnishings and adjoining land, passes into the full ownership of my wife Eleanor, regardless of the overall distribution of assets. This was a surprise even to me. I had thought the house would be counted in the common share, but Howard had decided otherwise. I felt a deep gratitude. He knew how much that house, filled with memories of our life together, meant to me. When Bramble finished reading, there was silence in the room. The notary took off his glasses and looked around the room. Any questions about the contents of the will? Noel cleared his throat. Is this the final version? He asked. Had the father made no changes in the last, say, months? Bramble shook his head. This is the final version of the will, signed by Mr. Hollister 6 months ago in the presence of 2 witnesses. It's all drawn up according to the law and beyond question. Noel nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. I could only guess what he was thinking, perhaps fearing that his father might have changed the terms out of his favor after their last conflict. Is there anything else we need to know? He asked, rising. Any additional documents, conditions? It's all contained in the reading of the will, Bramble answered, gathering up the papers. Of course it will take some time to complete all the necessary paperwork, but the big picture is clear. He turned to me, his tone warmer. Eleanor, I've prepared copies of all the documents for you. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. I nodded gratefully, noticing Noel watching this exchange of remarks. Bramble wasn't addressing me as a client's widow, but as an old acquaintance, almost a family member. It was a subtle but noticeable shift in my status from father's wife to Howard Hollister's esteemed widow. Camille touched her husband's arm lightly. Noel, we should go. The kids have class at 4. He nodded, but didn't move, as if he were still waiting for something to happen. Finally, apparently satisfied with Bramble's answers, he turned to his wife. Yes, of course. Let's go out for some air. It's stuffy in here. They headed for the door, but at the exit, Noel stopped and turned to me. Eleanor, Camilla and I will discuss the management of our share of the company. I'll contact Mackenzie about a growth strategy. I have a few ideas that my father hasn't had time to implement. His tone was businesslike, as if we were discussing a routine business matter rather than his father's inheritance. I noticed how he emphasized our share, separating himself from me even in that context. Of course, Noel, I replied calmly, remaining in my comfortable chair. I'm sure Richard will be glad to hear your suggestions. He nodded briefly and left without saying goodbye. Camilla followed him, casting me an unreadable glance. The kids were the last to leave, and Laurel waved tentatively, which I took as a small ray of hope that maybe not everyone in this family was against me. As the door closed behind them, I felt the tension leave my body. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been the whole time. Are you all right, Eleanor? Bramble asked with genuine concern, changing to an informal tone again. Yes, I smiled weakly. It's just that this whole thing is a little surreal. A month ago, Howard and I were planning a summer vacation, and now I'm sitting here listening to his estate being divided. Bramble nodded understandingly. Death always comes at the wrong time, even when it's expected, and when it comes suddenly, as it did in Howard's case, it's especially hard. Through the large office window, I watched Noel and his family leave the building. They stopped on the sidewalk, and I noticed Noel animatedly saying something to Camille, gesturing vigorously. She was nodding, occasionally inserting short lines. The children stood nearby, clearly bored. I couldn't hear them talking, but I could tell from the looks on their faces that they were talking about the will and the plans for their inheritance. Noel looked excited, almost exhilarated, as if he'd won the lottery rather than inherited from his father, who'd just died. Don't think about them now, Bramble said softly, noticing the direction of my gaze. You need to take care of yourself, Eleanor. Grief requires time and attention. I turned to him gratefully. Thank you, Aldous, for everything. The organization, your patience, your kindness. Howard was my friend, he said simply. I promised him I would take care of you, and I will keep that promise. I gathered my things and stood up, feeling a strange emptiness inside. The will was fair, even generous, but somehow I felt that Howard wanted to say something else, that there was a deeper meaning behind the formal lines of the legal document. If you have any questions or need help with the paperwork, feel free to contact me anytime, Bramble said as he walked me to the door. I will, I shook his hand. Thanks again. As I walked outside, I saw Noel and his family still standing nearby. They were so engrossed in their conversation that they hadn't noticed me. I heard a snippet of Noel's phrase. Update the entire marketing strategy. Dad's been too conservative. It's time to move with the times. Camille said something and they both laughed. Then Noel noticed me and suddenly cut the conversation short. His face took on a neutral expression. Eleanor, he nodded. We're leaving now. We should be back in Boston by tonight. Of course, I tried to smile. Have a safe trip. We'll get back to you about the company, he added. We need to discuss development strategy. Yes, I nodded. When you're ready. He nodded briefly, then turned to his wife and children, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. They headed to their car without looking back. I stood on the sidewalk watching them drive away and felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Despite his formal decorum, Noel made no secret of his feelings for me. To him, I had always been and would always be a stranger to their family, an undeserved half of what he thought should be his alone. I walked slowly home, thinking about the strange feeling that had lingered after reading the will. Howard was a meticulous, detail-oriented man. Everything he did had meaning and purpose, and his will, so fair and balanced at first glance, somehow seemed incomplete to me, unfinished. It was a week after the reading of the will. Life in Everglade was gradually returning to normal, at least outwardly. Stores opened in the morning, children went to school, neighbors exchanged greetings across the fences. But for me, it was as if time had stopped. I wandered around the empty house, going through Howard's things, trying to work in the garden, anything to fill the resounding emptiness in my heart. The first call from Noel took me by surprise. He usually preferred to communicate via email or text if he couldn't avoid contact altogether. But now his name popped up on the screen of my phone, and I hesitated to answer. Eleanor, His voice sounded businesslike, without a trace of warmth. I've been talking to Mackenzie about the company. I have some restructuring proposals we need to discuss. Hello, Noel, I said, trying to sound calm. I'm not sure if this is the right time. Business is slow, he interrupted. We're losing ground in the market. Father has delayed the necessary changes for too long. I want to meet with you and the board of directors next Tuesday. I swallowed, trying to collect my thoughts. Howard had never mentioned any problems with the company. On the contrary, he'd been particularly pleased with the results in recent months. Their new line of low-cost generics was showing steady growth. Noel, I don't think I can make those decisions right now. It's only been a few weeks. That's why we need to act quickly, he interrupted again. If you don't feel ready to participate in the governance, you can give your votes to me. I'll take care of everything. His sentence sounded too smooth, as if it had been prepared in advance. I felt a vague unease. Thank you for your concern, but I'd like to talk to Richard personally first, I replied. He'd be better able to explain the current situation to me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Whatever you want, Noel finally said with barely contained irritation. But don't say I didn't offer to help. After that conversation, I called Richard Mackenzie. He was surprised to hear about the company's problems. Eleanor, we're doing just fine, he assured me. Of course Howard's death was a shock to everyone, but business is steady. I don't know what Noel told you, but there's nothing to worry about. His words reassured me a little, but left me wondering why Noel would want to exaggerate the problems. The answer came a few days later when Martha called me in a strange excitement. Did you hear? She asked without preamble. About what they're saying in town? What are you talking about? I felt a chill run down my spine. Noel's making it clear that he's going to contest his father's will. He says that Howard hasn't been himself these past few months, that you... She stammered, clearly reluctant to say the next words. That I what? I insisted. That you manipulated him, Martha exhaled. That you used your psychological knowledge to influence his decisions. That you were only ever with him for the money. I slumped back in my chair, feeling the room begin to spin. These accusations were so far from the truth, so insulting, that it took my breath away. Eleanor, are you there? Martha asked worriedly. Yes, I said. I didn't even expect this from Noel. No one believes him, she assured me quickly. Anyone who knew you and Howard knows what a load of crap that is. But he's been talking to James Howard. James Howard was the editor of the local newspaper, a sensation and gossip columnist. If Noel did talk to him, then he wanted the story to get maximum publicity. Thanks for the warning, I said to Martha. Think about what to do. After the conversation, I sat still for a long time, trying to make sense of the situation. Of course, I knew Noel had always disliked me, but I'd never thought he'd go this far. To publicly accuse me of manipulating Howard's will, to make me look like a money hunter, that was a new level of hostility. The next day, I saw an article in the Everglades Gazette. The headline read, Hollister Family Drama. Pharmaceutical Magnate's Son Challenges Will. It was full of innuendo and conjecture. Though it did not directly accuse me, apparently James Howard feared a libel suit. My phone started ringing off the hook. Friends, acquaintances, even former students called to express support or just to find out what was going on. I answered only the ones closest to me, letting the others leave messages on my answering machine. That evening, Bramble called. I saw today's paper, he said without preamble. Outrageous. I've already contacted Noel and warned him that if he continues to spread these insinuations, we'll sue him for libel. Thank you, Aldous, I replied, touched by his defense. But I don't want to sue Noel. It would only increase the scandal and hurt Howard's memory. Then what are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. I need to think it over. The next few days were a nightmare. Everywhere I went, the store, the post office, even church, I could feel the stares. Most people were friendly. Some even came over to offer support, but there was also some banter behind me, and conversations that suddenly broke off when I appeared. Noel, meanwhile, had gone from words to action. He formally filed a petition to invalidate the will, claiming that Howard was under my influence and unable to make rational decisions. He hired a prominent Boston attorney specializing in contesting wills. Bramble contacted me immediately. Eleanor, this is serious now, he said. We need to prepare for a trial. I have some good lawyers in mind, but we have a videotape that proves Howard's sanity, I objected. You said yourself that the will was legally flawless. Yes, but Noel's trying to build a case not on technicalities, but on the alleged emotional impact, Bramble explained. He claims that you, as a psychologist, skillfully manipulated Howard, playing on his feelings. That's harder to disprove. I shook my head, feeling tired. The thought of a lengthy lawsuit, of our family life being publicly gargled, of Howard's name being dragged into a messy legal battle, it all seemed unbearable. That evening, I received a letter from Camilla, the first I had received in all the years I had known her. It was written on expensive monogram paper, and the handwriting was neat and sure. Dear Eleanor, I am writing to you as woman to woman, as mother of a family. The situation we find ourselves in hurts us all. I know you loved Howard, and I'm sure he would hate to see his family torn apart over money. Noel is deeply affected by his father's death, and his actions are not motivated by greed, but by a sense of justice. He believes that the family business, created by his grandfather and developed by his father, should remain in the Hollister family. Quentin and Laurel are Howard's only grandchildren, the continuation of the lineage, and he has always hoped that one day they will take over the running of the company. I urge you to consider a peaceful solution. Perhaps we could agree on a compromise that avoids a long and painful legal process. Noel is ready to provide you with a comfortable life in the home that means so much to you. Sincerely, Camille Hollister. I reread the letter twice, trying to understand the meaning behind it. At first glance, it seemed reasonable and conciliatory. But between the lines, it was the same: to give up my share of the inheritance in favor of Noel and his family. As I pondered my answer to Camille, I wandered around the house, stopping at the pictures, remembering the moments I'd spent with Howard. Here we are at the opening of our third pharmacy. Howard cutting the ribbon, me standing beside him, proud and happy for him. Here's our trip to Italy. We're in front of the Colosseum, tired but enthusiastic. Here's last Christmas. Howard in the ridiculous reindeer sweater I gave him as a joke, and he wore it with such gusto that I felt ashamed of the gift. I went into his office, a place I'd avoided since his death. Everything here was still untouched. The unread book on the desk, the glasses in the case, the calendar open on the date of his death. I ran my fingers over his chair, imagining him sitting here, working late into the night, occasionally lifting his head to smile at me when I brought him tea. In this room among his things, I suddenly realized clearly, the money, the company, the stock, none of it mattered to me. The only thing I wanted to keep was this house, where every corner held a piece of Howard. Everything else was just papers, numbers, abstractions. I went to the phone and dialed Bramble's number. Aldous? It's Eleanor. I've made my decision. I'm listening to you, he said with a wary tone. I don't want to sue Noel, I said firmly. I refuse to fight for the inheritance. Eleanor, Bramble began cautiously, I understand your feelings, but think about it. Howard wanted you to be provided for. I can't fight this war for money, I interrupted him. I lost the Howard I loved most in the world. What do I care about the millions? I don't need it. If Noel cares so much about the inheritance, I'm willing to give up my share. The only thing I ask is to be able to stay in our house. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure, Eleanor? Bramble asked at last. This is a very serious decision. Maybe you should think it over again. I have thought it over, I said calmly. This decision will bring me more peace than any money could. Good, Bramble said slowly. In that case, we need to formalize it legally. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? Certainly. Would 10 o'clock suit you? Perfect, he answered. And I thought there was a strange note of satisfaction. I'll prepare all the necessary paperwork. The morning was clear, as if nature itself approved of my decision. I woke up early, with an unusual lightness in my heart. For the first time in weeks, I felt confident that I was doing the right thing. I had chosen the same black dress for the meeting with Bramble that I had worn to the reading of the will. Simple elegance had always been closer to me than pretentiousness. Howard had often said that he loved me for that naturalness, for my lack of desire to impress. Before I left, I lingered by our wedding picture in the hallway. I'm doing this for us, I whispered, looking at Howard's smiling face, to keep the memory of our love alive. The drive to Bramble's office was only 15 minutes. Everglade was a small town where everything was within walking distance. I walked leisurely, enjoying the spring air, nodding to familiar faces. Some looked on with curiosity, others with sympathy. News of Noel's lawsuit had spread quickly, of course. As I approached the notary's office, I noticed a black car parked across the street. In it sat a young man who, when he saw me, hurriedly turned away and pretended to look for something in the glove compartment. Something in his behavior seemed strange to me, but I did not pay much attention to it. Mrs. Pierce greeted me with a warm smile, as always. "Minus Mr. Bramble is waiting for you, Mrs. Hollister," she said, as she ushered me into a familiar office. "May I offer you some tea?" "No, thank you," I said. "I think we'll skip the ceremony today." Aldous Bramble came up to meet me. He looked particularly solemn today, in his dark blue suit, his tie impeccably tied. "Eleanor." He shook my hand with unusual formality. "Please, sit down." I sank into the same comfortable chair I'd used last time. Bramble took his place at the desk, spreading out some papers in front of him. "Before we begin," he began, "I need to make sure that you are fully aware of the consequences of your decision. You are giving up a substantial amount of money and valuable assets." "I understand that, Aldous." I nodded. "And my decision hasn't changed since yesterday." He looked at me carefully, as if trying to get into my thoughts. "May I ask why? Don't get me wrong, I admire your unselfishness. But most people don't turn down such sums of money without a good reason." I sighed, searching for words. "Money was never my first priority, Aldous. I loved Howard for who he was, not for what he had. Now that he's gone, those millions won't make me happy. They won't bring me my husband back. And to fight for them, to be involved in a messy legal battle, to listen to Noel's accusations, will only tarnish the memory of our love." Bramble nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had long suspected. "It is a worthy position, Eleanor. Howard would be proud of you." He pushed the papers toward me. "Here is a formal declaration of disinheritance, except for the house, which remains in your possession under a special clause in the will. Please read it carefully and sign it if you agree to the terms." I took the documents and began to read. The legal language was dry and impersonal, so unlike how I felt. It was strange to see Howard and I's life, our love, our memories turned into lines of contract, into numbers and paragraphs. When I finished reading, I picked up the pen Bramble held out to me. I stared at the blank signature line for a moment, then resolutely put my name. "That's it," I said, handing the papers back to Bramble. He accepted the papers, but didn't hurry to look them over. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a new expression, a mixture of respect and satisfaction. "Not quite everything, Eleanor," he said abruptly. "There's something else you should know." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope on which I recognized Howard's handwriting. "This is the last part of Howard's will, which I was only supposed to open under certain circumstances," Bramble said, stroking the envelope with his long fingers. At that moment, the study door opened abruptly, and Noel appeared on the threshold. His face was contorted with anger, his tie bent sideways as if he were running or wrestling with someone. "I knew it!" he exclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at us. "Secret meetings, secret documents. What are you up to behind my back?" Bramble rose, his face unruffled. "Minus Mr. Hollister, you're intruding on a private meeting. I must ask you to leave the office." "Not until I know what's in this envelope." Noel stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the paper in Bramble's hands. "What are these certain circumstances? What are you hiding?" I sat dumbfounded, not realizing what was happening. How did Noel know about our meeting? Why was he so furious? "Noel," I began, trying to keep my voice calm. "We didn't—" "Shut up!" he shouted. "I'm not talking to you. I know you've always manipulated your father, and now you're trying to pull some kind of scam with his will." "Minus Mr. Hollister." Bramble's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "If you don't calm down immediately, I will call the police. Your behavior is unacceptable." Noel took a deep breath, clearly trying to pull himself together. Then he readjusted his jacket and spoke more calmly. I have a right to know what is happening to my father's inheritance. My man saw Eleanor entering your office, and I wanted to know what it was all about. Your man? I asked, suddenly remembering the strange young man in the car. Were you following me? Noel didn't dignify me with an answer, continuing to stare at Bramble. What's in the envelope? He repeated. Bramble looked thoughtfully at Noel, then at me, then back at the envelope in his hands. At last, he seemed to have made up his mind. Well, perhaps this really is the moment, he said, more to himself than to us. Sit down, Mr. Hollister. What I'm about to read concerns you as well. Noel hesitated, then reluctantly lowered himself into the chair beside me, his posture tense, ready to jump up at any moment. Before I open this envelope, Bramble said, I must explain something. Mrs. Hollister has come today to formally renounce her share of the inheritance, retaining only the house. What? Noel turned to me, his face expressing disbelief and suspicion. Why? Because money isn't important to me, I answered simply. I loved your father, not his fortune, and I don't want to get involved in a legal battle that will only tarnish his memory. Noel looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. There was a flicker of something like confusion in his eyes that quickly changed to disbelief. It's a trick, he said, turning to Bramble. She's up to something. Nobody gives up millions for nothing. Not everybody measures the world by money, Mr. Hollister, Bramble replied. And that brings us to the contents of the envelope. He carefully opened the seal and took out a sheet of paper written in Howard's familiar handwriting. Coughing, Bramble began to read. If you are reading these lines, it means that what I foresaw has happened. I, Howard James Hollister, add the following condition to my main will. If any of the heirs voluntarily renounce their share, stating that money is not important to him compared to our relationship, the entire fortune goes to this person. Whoever fights for the money at any price will get nothing. There was absolute silence in the study. I stared at Bramble, not quite realizing the meaning of his words. Noel froze, his face gradually losing color. It's impossible, he said at last. It's a forgery. Father would never— The document is properly authenticated, Bramble interrupted him, turning the sheet over. Here is your father's signature, attested by 2 witnesses and a notary public. This document has full legal effect. Noel jumped up, his face contorted with rage. You set this whole thing up, he shouted, pointing accusingly at us. It's a conspiracy. You knew about this condition and you organized this spectacle on purpose. Minus Mr. Hollister, Bramble remained unperturbed. I can assure you that Mrs. Hollister did not know of this condition until today. Her decision to renounce her inheritance was entirely voluntary and sincere. Lies. Noel turned to me, his eyes burning with hatred. You've always been a cunning manipulator. You fooled your father and now you're trying to fool me. But I won't let that happen. I'll argue it in court. I looked at him, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, I felt something like pity, not resentment, not a desire to please. Noel, I said quietly, I didn't know about that condition. I really wanted to give up the money because it wouldn't bring your father back to me. And I'm sorry you can't believe that. Don't you dare talk about my father, he was almost shouting. You were never part of our family. You're just someone he slept with. His words, the same ones he'd thrown at me years ago in college, hit with unexpected force. But this time I didn't feel humiliation or pain, only a deep sadness for a man who could never see beyond his resentment and greed. You see, Mr. Hollister, Bramble said quietly, this is exactly the kind of behavior your father feared. That's why he included that clause in his will. Noel turned sharply toward him. I do not recognize that document. My lawyers will tear it apart. You're free to try, Bramble replied calmly. But I must warn you that your father was very thorough in legal matters. The document is impeccable. Besides, your behavior today, the surveillance, the intrusion into a private meeting, the unfounded accusations, only confirms the correctness of his decision. Noel fell silent, his gaze darting between Bramble and me. I could see the flicker of calculation, rage, disbelief, and finally the realization of defeat in his eyes. This isn't over, he said, heading for the door. You'll both regret it. When the door closed behind him, I took a deep breath, feeling my hands shake. Are you all right, Eleanor? Bramble asked softly. I'm not sure, I answered honestly. It's too much to comprehend. Bramble nodded understandingly. Howard had foreseen something like this. He knew his son well and understood how he would react to the will. But why didn't he tell me? I asked. Why didn't he warn me of his plan? Because then your decision wouldn't have been truly sincere, Bramble explained. Howard wanted to test the true motives of both of you without telling you about the condition. And you passed that test, Eleanor. You proved that you loved him, not his money. I shook my head, still trying to comprehend what had happened. I didn't want the whole inheritance, Aldous. I really only wanted the house. I know, he smiled. That's why you got it, along with everything else. The next weeks passed like a blur. Noel filed a lawsuit, as promised, challenging the secret part of the will. He hired a whole team of lawyers looking for any loophole, any inaccuracy in the documents. But Bramble was right. Howard had it all covered. He recorded a videotaped statement attesting to his sanity and voluntariness. He had the secret part of the will notarized by an independent notary and 2 witnesses unrelated to our family. He even left a written explanation of his motives, which was presented in court. I make this decision not out of a desire to punish or encourage anyone, Howard wrote, but to make sure that my inheritance goes to someone who values human relationships rather than material goods. I want my fortune to serve the good, not to become a cause of discord. The court declared the will valid. I was bitter to see Noel leave the courtroom with a face darkened with rage, but I knew this was not the time for reconciliation. The wounds were too fresh, the resentment too deep. I returned to the house that was now officially mine and Howard's with a heavy heart. The victory in court had brought me no joy, only the feeling that I had done my husband's last will. Gradually, I began to get to grips with the company's affairs. Richard Mackenzie proved to be an invaluable assistant, patiently explaining all aspects of the business to me. I did not seek active management, but wanted to make sure that the business to which Howard had devoted his life continued to thrive and serve people. We expanded an affordable medication program for the poor, an idea Howard nurtured in the last months of his life. Opened a new line of natural supplements for seniors. We improved working conditions for employees by increasing salaries and introducing fringe benefits. The home I wanted so badly to keep was slowly becoming not only a repository of memories, but a place of new beginnings. I set up a small counseling center in one of the rooms where, as a psychologist, I received elderly people, helping them cope with loneliness and loss. It was my own form of charity, a way of giving back some of the warmth that Howard shared with me. I hadn't heard much about Noel. He had moved with his family to California, where he was said to be starting a new business. I hoped that one day he would find the strength to understand his father's motives, if not to forgive him. But I didn't expect that in the near future. One day, going through Howard's things, I found an old notebook. Among the business notes and to-do lists, there was a page marked with my name. There were only a few lines written there. Ellie always saw me as a person, not a bank account. She's the only one who ever loved me for nothing, without conditions or expectations. I hope I can repay her with the same unconditional love. And if anything happens to me, I want her to know I've always seen her true worth. I clutched the book to my chest, feeling tears streaming down my cheeks. Not from grief, from gratitude for the years I'd spent with a man who understood me so well. A man who had taught me that true love transcended material things, beyond life and death. And I knew that despite all the trials, I would keep that love for the rest of my life.